Welcome, or welcome back. Tonight we're leaving the modern world behind. The pings, the screens, the to-do lists that somehow never get shorter. And we're drifting instead to a quieter time. A slower one. A place where the only notifications come from frogs by the river and the occasional grumpy goat. This is Egypt, but not the museum kind. No golden masks or dramatic pyramid heists tonight. We're stepping into the soft, quiet hum of everyday life. The sort of day that never made it into a textbook, but that happened over and over for thousands of years. It's just after sunset. The Nile glides silently under a darkening sky. Papyrus reeds sway at its edges. The day's heat is finally giving way to a gentle breeze. In the distance, a flute plays, not for an audience, just for the evening. A rhythm, a way to say, the day is done. Along the riverbank, people are finishing up their chores. A woman rinses a clay bowl. A child splashes their feet near the shore, pretending they're helping. A father ties shut the grain store, checking it twice. Not because he doesn't trust his neighbors, but because he knows the goats are better problem solvers than they look. Inside a small home made of mudbrick, a family settles into night. The air smells faintly of herbs, dust, and cooling bread. A lamp flickers near the wall. It's quiet, comfortable, uneventful in the best way. Tonight, we're not chasing pharaohs or decoding hieroglyphs. We're just going to be here, observing, listening, letting the pace of life slow us down. You'll hear about the little things. Waking up with the sun, grinding grain, swatting flies, sharing stories, and maybe wondering, quietly, if someone remembered to feed the cat. Yes, they had cats. And no, they did not consider them pets. The cats ran the place. Everything moved at the pace of the Nile, steady, patient, winding. There were no alarms, no morning traffic, just seasons, floods, harvests, rest. This is the version of history made not of grand events, but of daily repetition, the comforting kind. And that's what we're here for. Not facts to memorize, not names to recite, just a story to fall into, something to carry you gently into sleep. So if your eyes start to close, that's fine. If you drift off in the middle of a sentence, perfect. This story will still be here, flowing like the river, whether you catch every word or none at all. Let the sound of distant water carry you. Let the quiet of ancient Egypt wrap around you like soft linen. Tomorrow, the sun will rise and life will begin again. But for now, let's stay here, in the stillness, in the dark. The day is ending. The story is just beginning. If ancient Egypt had a heartbeat, it was the Nile. This river didn't just pass through the land, it defined it. Everything, from crops to calendars to gossip about whose field flooded first this year, revolved around it. The Nile wasn't just water, it was a slow-moving miracle. Each year, like clockwork, the river would rise. It would flood its banks, soaking the surrounding soil with rich silt, the kind of earth that practically begged things to grow in it. Wheat, barley, flax, and the occasional rogue onion patch all owed their existence to this grand, gentle flood. The Egyptians didn't see the Nile as something to conquer. They didn't try to pave it over or drain it into a swimming pool. They worked with it, waited for it, thanked it. They even built their calendar around it. Forget January. Here the year began with the flooding. Very on brand for a place that literally ran on river time. When the water receded, families got to work. They waded through the muck, planting seeds by hand. No machines, no rush, just rhythmic, repetitive movement. Soft footsteps in wet soil, the whisper of reeds in the breeze. A kind of farming that felt more like ritual than labor. You might imagine that people lived right on the river's edge, but no, that was mosquito territory. And the Nile's temperamental side, flooding when it felt like it, then shrinking away, meant that homes were built a respectful distance back. close enough to fetch water, far enough to avoid surprises. Fetching water, by the way, was a daily event. Morning and evening, women and girls carried jars on their heads with the kind of balance that would make any modern yoga instructor weep with envy. The jars were heavy, the path uneven, and yet, not a drop spilled, most days. The river was also the main road. Boats of every size glided up and down, some sleek and papyrus-built, others chunky and wood-planked. They carried grain, cattle, beer, gossip, and sometimes the occasional tax collector who, for some reason, always seemed to arrive right after harvest. Children played along the banks. They fished with nets or simply jumped in to cool off. Crocodiles existed, yes, but like most adult dangers, they were generally ignored until someone's uncle had a close call and spent the next month telling that story to anyone who'd listen, or didn't. Spiritual life flowed through the Nile, too. It was a gift from the gods, specifically Hapi, the deity of flood and fertility. Offerings were made, songs were sung. People thanked the river for life and hoped it would behave itself for another year. And most of the time it did. So when someone in ancient Egypt said, "The river provides," they weren't being poetic. They were being literal. It watered their fields, moved their goods, and cooled their evenings. It was, quite simply, everything. The Nile didn't just run through the land, it ran through their lives. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but already the air is shifting. Night's cool grip is loosening, giving way to the slow build of warmth that will settle over the village by mid-morning. Inside a modest mudbrick home, someone stirs. The house is small, square, and made from the very earth it sits on. Thick walls, dried in the sun, keep the inside cooler than the dusty world outside. The roof is flat, made of reeds and timber. It isn't glamorous, but it holds its shape and its shade. There's no bedroom, not in the way we know it. Families sleep in shared spaces, sometimes inside, sometimes on the roof during hotter months. Woven mats made from palm fibers are rolled out at night and stored away during the day. Comfort is a relative term. No one's bragging about thread counts here. But after a long day of work, even packed earth starts to feel like a feather bed. First awake is usually the mother. She moves quietly, adjusting her wrap and tying back her hair with practiced hands. She lights the small clay lamp if it's still dim out. No one likes a stubbed toe in a room full of pottery and sleeping relatives. Next, a child stirs. Then another. Siblings elbow each other and pretend not to notice. The family dog lifts its head, then decisively puts it back down. Not its turn yet. There's no alarm clock, no calendar reminders. Just the knowledge that there's always something to be done. Water to collect, grain to grind, goats to discourage from chewing on things they shouldn't. A simple morning begins. The father sits at a low table, sharpening a blade or checking the condition of a tool. A teenager, old enough to help, still young enough to try avoiding it, gathers a basket, pretending not to hear the list of errands being recited. Spoiler: they definitely heard. The home smells faintly of last night's meal. There's a hearth in the corner, its coals still warm. Bits of ash and flour mark the workspaces like sleepy footprints. Someone adds straw to the fire, blowing gently until it flares. No one speaks loudly. There's no need to. Everything here moves in quiet coordination, like a slow dance repeated every morning for generations. Outside, the village comes alive. Soft voices, the clink of pottery, the call of birds. The rhythm of life doesn't rush. It unfolds. And this house, like thousands of others along the Nile, wakes up the same way. Slowly, simply, with tasks ahead and no reason to panic about them. So as the light begins to fill the doorway and dust motes spin lazily through the air, the family begins another day, just as they always have. No snooze buttons, no chaos, just morning. Now that the village is stirring and the sun is climbing, it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll take long. Clothing in ancient Egypt was many things: functional, symbolic, comfortable in the heat, and perhaps most importantly, low maintenance. There were no wardrobes stuffed with options, no long debates over outfits. Linen was the answer, and linen was always the answer. The average Egyptian wore garments made from flax, spun into linen that was light, breathable, and as close as one could get to ancient air conditioning. Men typically wrapped themselves in kilts or short skirts. Women wore long, form-fitting dresses with simple straps. Children often skipped the whole clothing thing altogether, at least until someone important came by or the sun started to feel sharp. Modesty was relative. Laundry loads were minimal. A good linen tunic could last for years. Of course, by good, we mean not completely see-through. Some wealthier families bleached or pleated their linen for flair. Others layered, not for fashion, but because their best tunic was a little drafty. It was never about style. It was about heat, movement, and getting through the day without turning into a walking sun-dried tomato. But while the clothing was simple, grooming was anything but. Hair was a whole thing. Wigs were worn by nearly everyone, not out of vanity, but because lice were not a trend anyone wanted to revisit. Real hair was often shaved. Wigs were made of human hair, wool, or plant fibers, styled, oiled, and sometimes perfumed with cones of scented fat that slowly melted throughout the day. An ancient solution to both hair care and personal fragrance. Efficient, if a bit slippery. Eyes were lined with kohl, not just for decoration, but for practical reasons. It reduced glare from the sun and helped prevent infections. Essentially, everyone walked around looking a little bit like they were ready for a smoky eye photo shoot, even if their actual plan for the day was grinding barley and yelling at goats. Jewelry was common too: necklaces, bracelets, amulets. Even poorer Egyptians wore simple beads or charms made from clay or copper. Wealthier individuals went in for gold, lapis lazuli, and faience. But no matter the material, these accessories weren't just decoration. They were protection. Little spells against misfortune, worn like armor. Perfumes and oils were a big part of daily life. Skin needed protection from the sun and dryness, and people preferred to smell pleasant, especially if they were going to be anywhere near one another. Which, let's be honest, they were. These homes weren't exactly spacious. By the time the household was dressed and groomed, everyone looked, well, put together. Not polished in a modern sense, but clean, purposeful, and presentable for whatever the day might bring. There were no mirrors on the walls, no social media to check, and no fashion magazines whispering about trends. Just the same linen, the same oil, and maybe, if it was a special day, a fresh bead or a slightly less melted wig. Practical, predictable, and exactly as it should be. With the sun now gently warming the earth and the morning routines wrapping up, it's time to think about food. Not a feast, just breakfast. Something humble, functional, and filling enough to power a day in the fields, at the loom, or by the river. There's no sizzling pan or aroma of brewed coffee here. No eggs Benedict or frothy milk mustaches. Instead, breakfast in ancient Egypt starts with a quiet kind of bustle. A low fire, still warm from the night before, is rekindled with straw and twigs. The hearth glows again, ready for bread. Flatbread was the staple of life. Made from emmer wheat or barley, it was coarse, dense, and occasionally contained the odd bit of sand or grit, depending on how carefully the grain had been ground. Ancient dental records are full of worn molars for a reason. But no one complained. Bread was life. It fed everyone, from scribes to shepherds to the local temple cat. Next came beer. Yes, beer for breakfast, but not the fizzy party kind. This was more like a thick, fermented grain porridge, nutritious, hydrating, and just alcoholic enough to take the edge off a particularly grumpy morning goat. Even children drank it, although theirs was usually weaker. A kind of ancient breakfast smoothie, if you will. To go with the bread and beer, there might be onions, dates, or a smudge of cheese if the household was lucky. Maybe some figs, maybe not. Meals were based on availability, not variety. What's for breakfast? Had only one answer: whatever we have. Preparation was communal. Women ground grain using heavy stones, pounding rhythmically, thump, scrape, thump, while humming or chatting quietly. It was hard work, and left a fine dusting of flour across arms, robes, and the floor. Children helped when they could, though helped might be a generous term. Sampling ingredients was considered quality control. There was no table as we know it. Meals were often eaten squatting or sitting on the ground. Food was served from shared dishes, and hands did the job of forks. It wasn't messy. It was just how things were. And if a stray cat managed to swipe a bite, well, that was between the cat and the gods. Though modest, breakfast was a moment of connection, a pause before the day's labor. People ate quietly, focused on chewing and thinking. There was no rush. No one was running late to a chariot appointment. Just calm, bread, and the occasional side-eye toward a sibling who took too much of the date paste. As the bread disappeared and the beer bowls emptied, the household began to stir again. Tools were gathered. Tasks resumed. The peaceful stillness of the morning gave way to the slow churn of activity. But for a brief time, in the glow of the fire and the soft light of morning, there was only food, family, and the comforting predictability of the first meal of the day. Simple, slow, satisfying. Once breakfast is over, breadcrumbs brushed off, beer bowls rinsed, it's time to head into the fields. Not in a rush. There's no sprinting to the car or fussing about traffic. Just a slow gathering of tools, a steady walk under the growing sun, and the day's real work begins. Farming along the Nile wasn't just a profession. It was the backbone of civilization. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers, and their lives moved in rhythm with the land. Plow season, sowing season, harvest. Then wait and start again. It was dependable, if a bit dusty. Tools were simple: wooden plows, hoes, sickles made with sharp flint or copper blades. Oxen, if you had them, helped turn the soil. If you didn't, well, your shoulders got very familiar with the idea of manual labor. The work was hard, backs bent, feet muddied, hands calloused. But it was honest and, most days, uneventful, which, in a time without weather apps or backup grain shipments, was the goal. The day started early to avoid the harshest heat. Men and women moved together down narrow paths to the fields, carrying baskets, jars, and tools. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes someone sang, and everyone pretended not to hear them go off-key. It was a routine, familiar, predictable. The land along the Nile was generous, especially after the floods left behind a layer of rich, dark silt. Seeds sank easily into the soil, and with a little tending, they'd grow, if the birds didn't get to them first. And the birds were always watching. Farmers waved reed sticks or made scarecrows from old tunics and broken baskets. Some swore by singing to the crops. Others swore at the birds. Both had mixed results. Irrigation was essential. Shadufs, those long wooden poles with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, lifted water from canals into smaller channels. It was repetitive work, up and down, scoop and pour all day long. Like an ancient gym session, minus the membership fees and motivational posters. During breaks, workers rested under palm trees or in the shadows of nearby walls. Lunch was modest, more bread, maybe some dried fish or onions. There was no feast, just enough to keep going, enough to return to the rhythm. Children helped too, not out of obligation, but because extra hands were always needed, and because tagging along with adults meant you got a splash in the mud and maybe catch a frog, or lose a sandal, or both. By mid-afternoon, the sun turned sharp and work slowed. No one wanted heat stroke, and nothing in the field was worth collapsing over. The walk home was quiet, tired, satisfied in that simple way only a fully used day can leave you. No spreadsheets, no meetings, just planting, watering, waiting. Ancient farming wasn't glamorous, but it fed cities, temples, even the scribes who never touched a plow in their lives. And for those who did the work, it meant food on the table and stories to mumble into their bread at dinner. Back in the village, while the fields hum with labor, the heartbeat of the home beats steadily, kept alive by the quiet, constant work of women. In ancient Egypt, women didn't live in the shadows. They weren't hidden away or treated like afterthoughts. Their roles were central, visible, woven into the everyday rhythm of life like the linen they spun. That said, no one gave them standing ovations for getting everything done before the rest of the household even noticed they were awake. Their mornings often began earlier than anyone else's. By the time the rest of the family was stretching and blinking into the daylight, a woman had already stoked the hearth, ground the grain, and was halfway through organizing who needed what and where. Inside the home, women managed. And not in the modern I'm managing sense that means barely surviving, but in the full, active, never-stop-moving kind of way. Cooking, cleaning, grinding flour, weaving textiles, preserving food, making beer, and raising children. Often all at once, with a baby on one hip and a dog begging underfoot. They knew how to read the sky, the soil, and their children's facial expressions before any crying began. They were doctors, in a practical sense, using herbs and remedies passed down through generations to treat everything from headaches to insect bites to, he ate something weird again. Outside the home, their influence was still felt. Some women helped in the fields during planting and harvest. Others sold goods in markets: linen, fish, pottery, perfumes. They negotiated prices with the kind of calm authority that suggested they'd already won the argument before it started. Legally, women in Egypt had more rights than in many later civilizations. They could own property, sign contracts, and even initiate divorce. It didn't mean life was easy, but it did mean they weren't invisible. A woman could be a priestess, a musician, a brewer, a healer. And while most didn't hold public office, some did. A few even ruled. You may have heard of Hatshepsut. She made boss energy fashionable before the term existed. Then there was the home economy, the daily budgeting of food, fabric, and time. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of cloth was reused. Every broken pot had a second life as a lid or a planter or a lesson in what not to drop. And through it all, women held the social threads together. They remembered who needed what, who was due for a visit, whose cousin had a baby last week. They planned festivals, cooked for extended families, and somehow found time to braid their hair and polish a bit of copper jewelry when the day slowed down. The role of women wasn't framed by loud declarations or grand monuments. It was quiet, powerful, constant. Without them, the home, and probably the entire kingdom, would have fallen apart before lunch. In ancient Egypt, children were everywhere, loud, barefoot, laughing, bickering, running just a little too close to someone carrying something fragile. Life wasn't just built around children, it flowed around them. They were expected, welcomed, and gently, or not so gently, woven into the daily pattern of things. There weren't many baby books or parenting scrolls, no strict what to expect guides. You learned by watching your parents, your siblings, your neighbors, and usually by making a few mistakes along the way, like picking up a snake that looked friendly. From the moment they could walk, children became part of the daily routine. Little ones tagged along on errands, copied their parents' chores, and quickly learned the difference between being helpful and being in the way. Spoiler, it was a moving target. Toys existed, but they were simple. Carved wooden animals, dolls made of cloth and clay, balls, spinning tops, and games with pebbles. There were no batteries, no screens, and no just 5 more minutes. Play was active, dusty, and surprisingly creative. When all else failed, chasing a chicken around the courtyard was always an option. Education started early, but it wasn't always formal. Most children learned through observation and repetition. Boys often followed their fathers to the fields, workshops, or docks. Girls helped their mothers with cooking, weaving, and managing the household. It wasn't gender politics. It was just division of labor based on what kept the roof from collapsing and the bread from burning. For the wealthier few, schooling was an option. These children, mostly boys, learned to read, write, and do arithmetic. They studied under scribes and practiced on pottery shards or papyrus, repeating phrases like, "Writing is better than farming," while their farmer cousins rolled their eyes from a distance. The script was beautiful but complex, and learning it took years. Mistakes were inevitable and, luckily, erasable, if you could afford more shards. Discipline was firm but practical. Lessons were enforced through repetition, not lectures. A child who left the grain basket open once might be sent to chase birds all day the next time. Consequences had a way of teaching that no one forgot twice. Children were cherished, not coddled. Illness, accidents, and hardship were constant threats, so every healthy child was a small victory. Parents protected when they could, taught when they must, and hoped the gods were paying attention the rest of the time. Coming of age wasn't marked by grand ceremonies. There was no official moment, just a slow shift. One day, you were watching your older brother catch fish. The next, you were holding the net yourself. Responsibilities replaced games, and no one told you when the change happened. You simply knew. Still, even adults remembered. They'd see a child pretending to grind grain or shouting at goats with too much enthusiasm and smile quietly. After all, they'd done the same thing not so long ago. In ancient Egypt, childhood wasn't a phase. It was a training ground. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't confined to temples or holy days. It was air. It was water. It was the rhythm beneath every action, from lighting a lamp to planting seeds, to whispering a quick prayer before attempting anything remotely risky, like opening a jar you didn't label last season. The Egyptian world was alive with gods. Not a distant pantheon watching from above, but a crowded family of divine personalities, interwoven into daily life like the threads of linen garments. Every town had its own local favorite. Every river bend, every breeze might carry a whisper of a presence. Some gods were grand and cosmic, others modest and specialized. And yes, some had the heads of animals. It wasn't fashion. It was symbolism, mostly. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky each day in his solar boat. At night, he battled chaos in the underworld. Egyptians didn't just watch the sunrise. They rooted for it. Every morning was a victory. Every nightfall, a risk. You couldn't see the drama, but you felt it, like ancient celestial theater. Then there was Osiris, ruler of the afterlife. His tale of death, resurrection, and divine rule wasn't just myth. It was a map. Egyptians looked to it for how to live, how to die, and what to expect after their final breath. Spoiler, it involved a judgment scene, some weighing of hearts, and a very discerning crocodile-lion-hippo hybrid. Anubis, with his jackal head, oversaw embalming. Isis, goddess of magic and healing, was the patron of mothers and mourners alike. Thoth, with an ibis head and a taste for writing, kept the divine records. There was even Bastet, protector of the home, goddess of joy, and proud cat enthusiast. Offerings were part of everyday life. A bit of bread, a splash of beer, a flower, left at household altars or temple thresholds. These weren't bribes, they were thank yous, gentle reminders that humans hadn't forgotten who ran the cosmos. Temples were more than places of worship. They were banks, schools, grain stores, and community centers. Priests didn't just preach. They bathed, shaved their heads, followed purification rituals, and tended statues as if they were living beings. Daily rituals were performed, not for show, but because the balance of the world, the Ma'at, depended on them. Speaking of Ma'at, it was more than a word. It was a principle: harmony, balance, truth. Not just cosmic law, but social glue. Egyptians didn't strive for perfection. They aimed for alignment, with nature, with each other, with the gods. And yet, religion wasn't always solemn. Festivals were loud, colorful, joyful affairs, filled with music, food, and enough beer to ensure someone danced badly by the end. People laughed, sang, lit lanterns, prayed with their feet as much as with their mouths. Faith was not a separate part of life. It was folded into everything, worn like amulets, sung in lullabies, whispered while grinding grain. In short, the gods weren't up there. They were right here, always watching, occasionally intervening, and probably appreciating the incense. A cough, a fever, a twisted ankle from chasing livestock a little too enthusiastically. Illness and injury were no strangers to ancient Egyptian life. But neither was healing. Medicine in Egypt was a fascinating blend of practical observation and spiritual tradition. They didn't separate the body from the soul, the physical from the magical. If something hurt, chances were both your organs and your karma needed attention. At the heart of healing were the SNW, physicians. Some specialized in treating eyes, others focused on belly troubles or mysterious rashes that made people itch and blame the gods. The ancient Egyptian medical system was advanced for its time, organized and surprisingly specific. They even had what we might call medical texts, scrolls like the Edwin Smith or Uber's Papyrus, filled with remedies, case descriptions, and instructions that ranged from helpful to ambitious. Let's talk ingredients. Honey was a staple, antibacterial, sweet, and excellent for wounds. It stuck around for a reason. Garlic and onions weren't just for flavor. They were go-to prescriptions for everything from fatigue to spiritual cleansing. Moldy bread? Surprisingly modern, used to treat infections, likely before they understood why it worked. Other treatments involved herbs like coriander, dill, and fenugreek. Sometimes crushed, sometimes boiled, sometimes mixed with less appetizing components. Crocodile dung makes more appearances in the record than you might expect. No one said ancient medicine lacked creativity, but treatment wasn't all lotions and potions. Spells were essential. Disease could be caused by malevolent spirits or divine displeasure. A healer might recite a charm while applying a poultice, combining the tangible and the intangible in one smooth motion. You couldn't be too careful, especially if a ghost had taken a particular interest in your spleen. Surgery existed, though it was usually limited to wounds, fractures, or abscesses. Trepanning, the act of drilling into the skull, doesn't appear often in Egyptian records, which is probably for the best. Their version of anesthesia, wine, perhaps prayer, and a brave patient. Dentistry was a challenge. With all that gritty bread, teeth wore down fast. Cavities were rare, but exposed nerves were not. Solutions included packing the tooth with herbs, oils, or pastes. No braces, no fluoride. Just endurance, and the occasional amulet for extra protection. Women often served as midwives and caretakers, managing childbirth and domestic health with deep knowledge and calm authority. Birthing stools, amulets, and spells were part of the process. Babies were welcomed with rituals, and their survival was treated as both a victory and a blessing. At the end of the day, healing in ancient Egypt wasn't just about fixing the body. It was about restoring balance between person and spirit, between illness and health, between the earthly and the divine. It wasn't always perfect, but it was thoughtful, human, and built on the quiet hope that tomorrow would be better. And if not, well, there was always more garlic. While the Nile's fields demanded sweat and strength, life back home carried its own quiet momentum. The domestic sphere in ancient Egypt didn't shout. It hummed, a rhythm of daily routines and unspoken tasks, performed over and over again, like ripples in water. Not flashy, not fast, but essential. Egyptian homes varied. Wealthier families had multi-room mudbrick houses with courtyards and storage spaces. Modest homes were simpler, maybe a single room with a flat roof that doubled as a sleeping space during hot nights. And regardless of size, everyone faced the same daily puzzle: how to keep things in order when half your tools were handmade and the other half walked off yesterday. Cooking was central. Most homes had a small hearth, either indoors or just outside, with clay pots blackened by use. Meals were cooked low and slow: stews, flatbreads, lentils, nothing rushed. There were no timers, no recipes taped to the wall. Just experience and instinct, and the occasional burnt crust that nobody admitted was their fault. Grinding grain was one of the most common tasks. A large flat stone called a quern sat in the corner, and every day someone would kneel and push a smaller stone back and forth across it, reducing emmer wheat into flour. It was a full-body workout long before fitness influencers made that cool. The flour often ended up a little gritty, but people had tough teeth, or at least they did at first. Water had to be fetched. Buckets were lowered into nearby canals or wells, carried home carefully to avoid sloshing. Spilled water wasn't just wasteful, it meant another trip, and those trips got longer in the dry season. Cleaning was constant. Sand found its way into everything: beds, pots, clothing. Sweeping it out was like fighting the tide with a broom made of twigs. Still, the effort mattered. Clean homes were safer, calmer, and less likely to attract rodents or spirits with opinions. Weaving was another key task. Women spun flax into thread, then wove it into linen. This wasn't a side hobby. It clothed the household and sometimes became a source of trade or offering. A single tunic might take days to finish, but once complete, it was both practical and deeply personal. Storage jars lined the walls, filled with grain, dried dates, and the occasional surprise, like a gecko that had wandered in and immediately regretted it. Clay pots, baskets, and wooden chests held tools, oil, and amulets. Organization wasn't about perfection. It was about knowing where to find your fire-starting sticks before the sun went down. Children, animals, and visitors moved in and out all day. Goats bleated in courtyards. Chickens got into places they shouldn't. The home was never still for long, but it always returned to its rhythm. At the center of it all was care. Every scrubbed pot, every folded cloth, every carefully placed jar was part of maintaining life, simple, quiet, and enduring. No glamour, no gold, just the gentle art of keeping things running. Away from the fields and beyond the bustle of household life, another rhythm pulsed through ancient Egyptian society, one shaped by skilled hands, clever trades, and the murmur of the marketplace. Craftsmen were the unsung artists of daily life. Potters, carpenters, stonecutters, metalworkers. They didn't just build temples or statues for the gods. They built doors that didn't creak, beds that didn't collapse, bowls that held soup instead of leaking it onto your lap. They made the world livable. Training often began in youth. A boy might follow his father to the workshop, learning how to carve wood without splitting it, or how to smooth clay just enough that it didn't crack in the sun. There were no shortcuts, just repetition, and maybe a few minor burns, bruises, and the occasional learning experience involving a tipped-over jar of linseed oil. Artisans lived together in work-based communities, like Deir el-Medina, the village for tomb builders and painters near the Valley of the Kings. These neighborhoods were close-knit, noisy with conversation, filled with the sounds of chiseling, hammering, and spirited debates about who used up all the black paint. Metalworkers melted copper and bronze, pouring molten heat into simple molds. The results became tools, weapons, mirrors, or decorative items. Goldsmiths were the elite among craftsmen, handling materials so valuable they had their own guards. Every detail mattered. One misstep, and your cat-shaped amulet looked more like a startled mongoose. Then there were scribes, craftsmen of words. They learned to write in hieroglyphs, hieratic, and later demotic scripts. Their tools were palettes, reed pens, and scraps of papyrus or pottery. They didn't just write. They recorded history, managed inventory, and composed letters that may or may not have included passive-aggressive reminders to return borrowed donkeys. But if you wanted to see it all come together, the products, the people, the chaos, you went to the marketplace. Markets were lively, dusty, and full of voices. Merchants called out prices. Animals bleated in protest. And somewhere, someone was always trying to haggle down the cost of dried fish. Goods were displayed on mats or tables. Onions, linen, sandals, amulets, jars of oil, woven baskets, and occasionally a suspiciously grumpy cat that no one admitted belonged to them. Trade didn't just happen with coins. Bartering was common. I'll give you 2 loaves and a dried fig for that reed mat. Make it 3 loaves and you've got a deal. It was commerce with personality. No self-checkout, no receipt, just eye contact and trust. Women played a major role here too. They sold food, textiles, cosmetics. They knew the market's rhythm, the vendor's habits, and how to spot a customer who was just pretending to browse. By midday, the market began to quiet. Goods thinned out. Coins changed hands. Traders packed up their wares and began the walk home. The craftspeople and vendors of Egypt weren't seeking fame. They built, bartered, and baked not for glory, but for daily life, to keep the wheels turning, the homes equipped, and the temples stocked with offerings. And in doing so, they left behind the tools, goods, and artistry that tell us their stories today. Even in a world shaped by labor and ritual, ancient Egyptians made space for joy. Between grinding grain, chasing goats, and keeping the gods happy, there was still time for leisure, unhurried, homemade, and very much appreciated. Free time wasn't abundant, but when it came, people used it well. Families gathered under the shade of trees or rooftops. Neighbors shared meals, gossip, and laughter. And yes, despite the heat, someone always found the energy to suggest a friendly competition. Because apparently, human nature hasn't changed that much. Board games were a favorite. Senet was the most iconic, played on a grid of 30 squares with 2 sets of pawns and dice-like throw sticks. It wasn't just a pastime, it was tied to religious symbolism and the journey to the afterlife. But for players, it was also about strategy, luck, and maybe just a bit of side-eye when someone got too many good rolls in a row. Mehen, another board game shaped like a coiled snake, also entertained families and friends. We don't know the exact rules anymore, which might make it the ultimate ancient mystery, and perhaps a relief to modern players who already struggle with remembering Monopoly instructions. Children had their own ways of staying busy. They played tag, wrestled in the dust, balanced stones on their heads, and made toys from clay, wood, or discarded bits of pottery. No batteries, no flashing lights, just imagination and the occasional bump or bruise. Music filled the spaces between chores and prayers. Instruments were simple but expressive. Flutes made from reeds, harps, and lyres strung with gut or hair. Drums crafted from stretched animal skin. Clappers, rattles, and sistrums, the latter shaped like an ankh, provided rhythm. Some instruments were meant for ceremonies, but others were purely for fun. A few notes here, a simple melody there, and suddenly a quiet afternoon turned into a small celebration. Singing was everywhere. Songs for harvesting, for worship, for weddings. Songs to lull children to sleep, and songs to wake up a sleepy ox. Voices blended in temples, courtyards, and riverbanks alike. Some sang to entertain, others to remember. Lyrics often praised gods, told stories, or reminded listeners to enjoy life while they could. One common theme? Life is short, so eat, drink, and be joyful. And maybe don't skip the second helping of lentils. Dancing, also present, especially during festivals, where people let go of their daily burdens for a moment. Movements were slow, deliberate, full of meaning, and possibly more graceful when wine was involved. Even rest itself was valued. Sitting by the Nile, watching birds skim the water, or reclining with a friend as the sun dipped low, these moments mattered. They weren't wasteful, they were restorative. In the stillness between duties, ancient Egyptians carved out joy, not in grand gestures, but in shared games, soft songs, and simple company. Because even then, they knew life was hard, but that didn't mean it had to be joyless. Let's drift now into one of the more comforting corners of ancient Egyptian life: mealtime. If home is where the hearth is, then for the ancient Egyptians, it was also where the flatbread rose and the beer fermented. The foundation of most meals was bread. Not the fluffy kind you'd find in a modern bakery, but dense, hearty loaves made from emmer wheat or barley. Baked in clay ovens, these loaves were shaped by hand and often had a bite of grit from leftover chaff or sand. Dental care was not thrilled, but no one was going gluten-free just yet. Beer was the daily drink, mild, thick, and nourishing. It wasn't meant for rowdy parties, though it could get festive. Think of it as more of a liquid bread, a breakfast beer, a midday beer, a with-dinner beer. Brewed from partially baked bread and flavored with dates or herbs, it was a staple, not a luxury. Children drank it too, though theirs might have been watered down, less yeasty, and, hopefully, not too fermented. Vegetables filled the table: onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, cucumbers, lettuce, and radishes. These were easy to grow and even easier to flavor with oil and herbs. Protein came from fish pulled fresh from the Nile and poultry, ducks, geese, or sometimes even pigeons. Meat from cattle or goats was rarer, reserved for special days or wealthier households. For most, chewing on a dried fish with a side of leeks was a familiar evening ritual. Fruits were seasonal delights. Dates, figs, and pomegranates were especially popular. Sweet, sticky, and far less guilt-inducing than modern desserts. Honey was the primary sweetener, prized and carefully collected from hives that were just as temperamental as modern ones. If a dish had honey, you knew someone really liked you, or they had extra that week. Dairy was present, though limited. Milk, cheese, and yogurt-like products appeared here and there, though preservation in the desert climate wasn't exactly convenient. Still, a little cheese with flatbread? A treat. Meals weren't formal. People sat on mats or low stools, eating with their hands or dipping bread into stews. Plates were made of pottery, occasionally decorated, but mostly practical. Spoons existed, but fingers did most of the heavy lifting. For wealthier Egyptians, meals could be more elaborate. Multiple courses, servants, and plenty of wine. Tables were small and often portable. Dishes were brought out one at a time. And there was almost always music, because what's dinner without a little background harp? Feasting was common during festivals. Shared meals bound the community together. People ate in groups, passed around bowls, and argued over the last fig in the dish. Some things really don't change. But perhaps the most telling thing is what Egyptians left behind. Recipes etched on tomb walls, food offerings buried with the dead, and paintings of banquets meant to last forever. Eating wasn't just survival, it was comfort, ritual, and connection. So next time you dip a piece of bread in oil or sip something mildly questionable, think of them. They did it first, and possibly with more sand. When you picture ancient Egyptians, you might imagine flowing linen, dramatic eyeliner, and gold accents gleaming in the sun. And you're not wrong, but the real story of how they dressed and cared for themselves is both stylish and surprisingly practical. Start with linen. Egypt's hot, dry climate made this lightweight fabric the textile of choice. Made from flax plants, linen was spun and woven by hand. Soft if you were lucky, scratchy if you weren't. Most people wore it undyed, its natural off-white tone helping reflect sunlight and blend into the dusty surroundings. Simple tunics, kilts, and wraps made up the bulk of daily wear. The fancier pleats and decorative hems, those were for the well-off or the very patient. Children usually wore nothing at all until puberty. It wasn't scandalous, it was just sensible. When you're chasing geese under a desert sun, clothing is more of a suggestion than a necessity. Men often wore short kilts tied at the waist. Women wore longer, sheath-like dresses with shoulder straps. The upper classes had more fabric to work with, more layers, more length, and occasionally sheer pieces that were both fashionable and probably a bit annoying in a breeze. Accessories weren't reserved for royalty. Beaded necklaces, bracelets, anklets, and earrings were common across all classes. Materials ranged from semi-precious stones to colorful faience, a glazed ceramic that managed to be both affordable and attractive, like the ancient version of costume jewelry that didn't turn your wrist green. Now, grooming. Egyptians took hygiene seriously. With sand, sweat, and heat as daily companions, personal cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was survival. Public bathhouses weren't common, but people regularly washed with water from basins, using natron or clay-based soap. They oiled their skin to stay moisturized and fragrant, sometimes perfuming it with myrrh or lotus oil. Hair was another story. Many men and women shaved their heads entirely or wore their hair cropped short. Not just for fashion. Lice were a persistent problem, and a bald head was easier to keep clean. Wigs, however, were incredibly popular. Made from human hair or plant fibers, they came in various styles: short curls, long braids, and sometimes with decorative beads. Think of them as ancient Egypt's answer to both heat management and bad hair day solutions. Eyes were lined with kohl, made from crushed minerals like galena or malachite. More than just a bold look, it helped protect against the sun's glare and reduced eye infections. Aesthetic and medical, ancient multitasking at its finest. Men shaved facial hair and often the rest of their body too, with copper razors or tweezers. Beards were associated with the divine or the very elite, hence those fancy, fake ceremonial ones on statues of pharaohs. Even in death, appearance mattered. Tomb paintings often show the deceased looking radiant, wearing crisp white linen, perfectly shaped wigs, and just enough eyeliner to suggest they were ready for a tasteful eternity. Because to the ancient Egyptians, looking your best wasn't about trends. It was a reflection of order, respect, and mayat, harmony in life, right down to your sandals. In a land of towering monuments and eternal tombs, it's easy to forget the quieter revolution that shaped Egypt. Writing. Not everyone could read or write, but those who could held power, purpose, and just a little bit of papyrus-based prestige. Education in ancient Egypt wasn't universal. Most children learned at home by doing, herding goats, grinding grain, watching their parents patch roofs or shape bread dough. But for a select few, usually boys from elite or middle-class families, there was school. And by school, we mean long hours in a stuffy room being told to sit straighter, write neater, and stop daydreaming about fishing. Students trained to be scribes. The title of sesh, or scribe, was respected and surprisingly versatile. Scribes worked in temples, tax offices, granaries, construction sites, and even the military. Wherever something needed documenting, they were there, like ancient human spreadsheets. The primary writing materials? Papyrus scrolls, wooden boards, potsherds, and the occasional flattened piece of limestone. Ink was made from soot or ochre mixed with water and applied using reed pens. If you've ever tried writing with a stick dipped in murky liquid, you'll understand why neat handwriting was a lifelong pursuit. The most famous script, of course, was hieroglyphics, elaborate, symbolic, and beautiful. But it wasn't always practical for quick note-taking. So Egyptians also used cursive scripts like hieratic and later demotic. Less artistic, more efficient. Like switching from calligraphy to messy cursive when the teacher isn't looking. Lessons began early in the day, often at dawn, and were, let's say, rigorous. Teachers didn't assign homework. They were the homework. Copying moral tales, tax records, and letters over and over again wasn't punishment. It was the curriculum. Imagine writing the same phrase 100 times with no Ctrl+Z to save you. Discipline was strict. The phrase, "the ear of a boy is on his back," shows up in multiple texts. A poetic way of saying, some children only listen when they're being paddled. Ancient Egypt's version of tough love. Literacy wasn't just about status. It was survival in a bureaucratic world. Want to record how many sacks of barley you moved? You needed a scribe. Want your will preserved for the afterlife? Scribe. Want to file a complaint because someone borrowed your donkey and never returned it? Definitely get a scribe. Women rarely became scribes, though some high-born women and priestesses learned to read religious texts. Literacy wasn't forbidden, it just wasn't offered. Still, some women managed to leave behind written records, signatures, and even personal letters. Quiet voices echoing from the margins. Scribes often worked closely with priests, tax officials, and architects. They could climb the social ladder and sometimes even retire with a small plot of land, a decent reward for a lifetime of inky fingers and strained eyes. So while pyramids may have been built by muscle, they were organized by ink. Quietly, carefully, by people who spent more time with their scrolls than with the sun. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't a weekend activity. It was the framework, the air, the quiet hum behind everything, from planting crops to brushing crumbs off your tunic. Life was steeped in ritual, wrapped in myth, and kept in balance by an unspoken contract with the divine. At the heart of this spiritual landscape was Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. Not just a goddess, but a concept that held the universe together. Keeping Ma'at meant doing your job, respecting your neighbors, and occasionally offering a goose to a temple. It wasn't just polite, it was cosmic maintenance. The gods were many, and each had their domain. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky daily in his golden boat, fighting off chaos serpents before breakfast. Osiris ruled the afterlife, regal and mummified. Isis, his devoted wife, represented magic and motherhood, and also, unofficially, put up with a lot. Then there was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, often seen scribbling notes like the divine scribe he was, possibly correcting grammar. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were centers of economic, administrative, and political life. Only priests could enter the deepest chambers, where statues of the gods were bathed, perfumed, and offered meals that, in true divine fashion, went uneaten but were still appreciated. Daily temple rituals were elaborate. Waking the statue, clothing it in linen, burning incense, offering bread, beer, and maybe a little honey on the side. It was less about belief in the modern sense and more about showing proper respect, keeping up appearances, and preventing divine mood swings. Common people weren't usually allowed into temple interiors, but that didn't mean they were spiritually disconnected. Household shrines honored favorite deities, Bes for protection, Taweret for childbirth, or Hathor for love and music. Offerings were made at home, prayers whispered to carved figurines, and occasionally, complaints mumbled to the heavens about spoiled grain or noisy neighbors. Festivals brought religion into the open air. Celebrations could last for days, filled with music, processions, drinking, and even public boat rides for the gods. Sacred statues were paraded along roads or floated down the Nile, giving everyone a chance to show their devotion and maybe sneak a mid-festival nap under a fig tree. Death was not the end. It was merely a transfer, a long, paperwork-heavy transfer. The soul, or Ba, had to journey through the underworld, face judgment before Osiris, and, if found pure, enter the field of reeds, a pleasant eternity with friends, food, and no taxes. The catch? You had to pass the weighing of the heart test. If your heart was heavier than a feather, the devourer Ammit, part lion, hippo, and crocodile, would handle things, permanently. Religious belief wasn't static. Gods merged, evolved, and shifted in popularity. Aten, the sun disk, briefly took over under Akhenaten. But after his reign, most people quietly returned to their usual pantheon, possibly with a relieved sigh and a firm, "Let's not do that again." Through it all, religion in Egypt wasn't rigid. It was rhythmic, a quiet cadence of devotion and duty, echoing from temples, homes, and hearts for millennia. To ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was, in a way, just another journey, albeit one with more paperwork, spiritual checklists, and the occasional heart exam than most modern travel plans. When someone died, the first priority was preservation. Mummification wasn't just a funereal art, it was a sacred necessity. The body needed to be intact to house the soul in the next life. The process took around 70 days and began with purification, washing the body with Nile water, often accompanied by ritual incense. Cleanliness was, once again, next to godliness. Next came organ removal. The stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were carefully extracted and stored in canopic jars, each protected by a specific deity. The brain, oddly enough, was usually discarded, removed through the nose using a hooked instrument. It's safe to say neurology was not yet a priority. The body was packed with natron, a natural salt mixture to draw out moisture. After drying, it was wrapped in linen, layer after layer, often with amulets tucked between folds to offer magical protection. For the wealthy, golden masks and elaborate coffins completed the look. For others, simpler wrappings still held the same hope: passage to a peaceful eternity. The funeral was more than a goodbye. It was a performance. Professional mourners were hired to wail dramatically. Priests recited spells, sometimes over small statues called ushabtis, which would do the deceased's chores in the afterlife. Practical outsourcing, ancient style. The burial itself was symbolic. The tomb was a replica of the home, stocked with food, tools, furniture, and artwork showing the deceased enjoying their favorite activities: farming, fishing, feasting. A way to remind the universe, this is what I'd like to keep doing, please. But before paradise came the judgment. The soul entered the hall of two truths, where the heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and balance. If your heart was light, you were declared Ma'keru, or true of voice, and admitted into the field of reeds. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, Amat awaited. She didn't imprison or punish. She just ate. And that was that. For those who passed, the field of reeds was ideal, a mirror of earthly life, but better. No illness, no taxes. The Nile always at the right height. It was, quite literally, eternal retirement. Tombs mattered. From modest pit graves to elaborate pyramid complexes, the goal was protection, not opulence. Names and faces were inscribed so the soul would be remembered. Because forgetting someone, even in the afterlife, was a second death, one no one wanted to risk. Over time, tomb robbers and the desert shifted these plans. Still, many names and prayers survived. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions, acted like a cosmic guidebook. Turn left at the Lake of Fire. Avoid the crocodile-headed guy. Recite spell 125 with confidence. In the end, the ancient Egyptians didn't fear death. They prepared for it, carefully, lovingly, and in linen. They believed in a soul that traveled, remembered, and endured. A soul that, with enough preparation, could rest peacefully, forever. For a civilization that seemed rooted in the slow rhythm of the Nile, ancient Egypt was surprisingly connected to the world beyond its borders. Travel and trade weren't just practical. They were essential threads in Egypt's long golden tapestry. And though they didn't exactly have frequent flyer miles, Egyptians certainly got around. Most travel happened by boat. The Nile was the superhighway of ancient Egypt. North flowed the water, south blew the wind, meaning you could sail one way and row the other. That made trade efficient, if slightly sweaty. Small reed skiffs zipped around for short trips, while larger wooden ships hauled goods across long stretches, loaded with jars, livestock, and the occasional confused goat. Roads existed too, but they were dusty, rough, and best suited for donkeys, ox carts, or particularly determined people on foot. Still, Egyptians traveled overland to mines in the Sinai, quarries in the desert, and sacred temples nestled into cliffsides. Shoes were optional. calluses were not. Trade began early in Egypt's history and stretched far. They imported cedar wood from Lebanon because the Nile Delta wasn't exactly a lumber yard, copper from the Sinai, silver and tin from the Levant, incense from Punt, whose exact location still remains a bit of a mystery, and lapis lazuli from as far as Afghanistan. Lapis was prized for its deep blue hue, ideal for amulets, eye makeup, and giving statues just the right amount of flair. In return, Egypt offered grain, papyrus, gold, linen, and manufactured goods like glass beads and pottery. Essentially, everything a neighboring kingdom could want in exchange for shiny things and rare spices. Foreign relations were diplomatic, usually. Treaties were made, tributes exchanged, and princesses occasionally married off to seal the deal. One famous example, the Treaty of Kadesh, struck between Ramses II and the Hittites. It's one of the earliest known peace treaties in history, carved in stone, naturally, because paperwork should be built to last. But not all neighbors were friends. Border skirmishes flared. Nubia to the south was both a trading partner and frequent military target. The Libyans and the Sea Peoples caused more than a few royal headaches. Fortresses along Egypt's borders served as both defensive posts and customs checkpoints, ancient versions of anything to declare. Merchants weren't just wandering salesmen. They were cultural ambassadors, bringing back not just goods, but ideas, new fashions, foreign gods, exotic foods. Egyptians had a reputation for blending what they liked into their own traditions, perhaps the earliest known example of curated aesthetic. For most everyday Egyptians, travel meant visiting the local market, nearby temples, or family in the next village. But for scribes, priests, and officials, travel could mean long assignments to distant outposts or expeditions to mysterious lands. And for pharaohs, sometimes it meant leading campaigns or staging elaborate diplomatic visits, with enough fanfare to impress even the most jaded dignitary. Travel in ancient Egypt wasn't fast, but it was purposeful, measured, a slow drift outward, like ripples from a boat pushed gently into a river, carrying goods, stories, and the occasional overly curious monkey. And now, as we draw the curtain on this journey, we arrive not at an end, but at the echo that lingers long after the last torch flickers out. Egypt, as a civilization, left behind more than pyramids and myths. It left fingerprints, on stone, in language, in thought. Gentle imprints pressed into the world's memory. For over 3,000 years, Egypt endured. That's longer than the gap between Cleopatra and TikTok. Civilizations rose, flourished, and fell around them. But Egypt, anchored by the Nile and shaped by sand and stone, stayed. What made it last? Some say it was geography, protected by deserts, nourished by the river. Others point to structure, its bureaucracy, its scribes, its rituals. Or maybe it was belief, a worldview so cohesive that it wove daily chores and cosmic order into the same fabric. But nothing lasts forever. Foreign rulers came, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Gods were renamed, scripts faded, mummification gave way to monasteries. Still, Egypt never really disappeared. It transformed, layer by layer. Much of what we know came from the rediscovery of its secrets. The Rosetta Stone cracked open the code to hieroglyphics in the 19th century, like an ancient instruction manual accidentally left behind in a storage closet. Tombs were found, temples cleared, stories retold. And in those retellings, a new kind of life took root. Hollywood turned pharaohs into phantoms. Museums displayed once sacred statues in glass boxes, and tourists wandered temple courtyards where priests once whispered to gods. Egypt was remembered, yes, but through a lens that sometimes blurred reverence with spectacle. And yet, somehow, the dignity remains. In the gaze of a stone statue whose features haven't softened in 4 millennia. In a child's name echoing Nefertari or Thutmose. In the unspoken awe of standing before something older than memory, built by hands no one remembers, under skies that haven't changed. Egypt's legacy isn't just in what it built, it's in what it taught. That time is both fleeting and vast. That writing matters. That ritual has power. That beauty can last. Even today, when someone lines their eyes with coal, they echo Egypt. When someone lays a flower on a grave, honors an ancestor, or reads by candlelight, they walk with ghosts who once danced by the Nile. Quietly, simply, without realizing they're keeping an old rhythm alive. So as you drift off tonight, think not of pharaohs or pyramids, but of the people, the weavers and scribes, the farmers and children, the unnamed and unpainted, those who carried water and stories, who watched the sun rise over the river and wondered if tomorrow would bring the same heat. They lived, laughed, mourned, hoped, just like us. And now they whisper from the dust, not loudly, not urgently, but with the quiet weight of having once been here.